Now, I'm not sure if anybody even knows what a pre-visualization artist is. Does anybody have an idea? You know, initially you cheat. But you know, it took me a while to kind of figure out how important a pre-visualization artist is, and they're becoming more and more important now. I'll let Lauren tell you the details of what he does, but he actually sits at the front of a lot of these blockbusters and these movies and these television series and things that we see. You know, it doesn't just go from, you know, we've got a script and it goes directly to the director and the art director and they start up. Lauren's oftentimes working with someone months or years in advance, visualizing what something's going to look like. And oftentimes they take his direction for art and the way something may look, a mood, colors, etc. And that's where it starts. So without further ado, Lauren Wood.
Thank you. So this is kind of informal. Let me just throw this up here. So as Dan summarized, my job in particular is to work with the lead creative individual on a project, be it a video game. My specialty is actually films, but seeing how the economy is kind of on the fritz, it's very difficult, unless you're the one holding the money, it's very difficult to actually get a job in the film industry. So what I'm doing now is I'm currently working at a company called Gearbox Software up in Plano, and we're currently working on a game called Borderlands and Aliens Colonial Marines, which is based on the film Aliens. So specifics, okay, my job specifically is to interpret the written material for the project and work with the director to help him visualize it. Because usually, or in very few instances, you know, with the exception of somebody like James Cameron, who is a Renaissance man who does literally everything himself. He's a designer, a painter, physicist, mechanical engineer. That's why his movies are so profound in their, you know, in their lasting impacts. You know, not only in film industry and storytelling, but in technology. So, with the exception of him and a small group of people, most filmmakers in particular are very literal, very narrow-minded individuals who have no imagination, so they hire people like us to come in and basically tell them what they want to see. So that's, in a nutshell, that's pretty much what I do. Video games is a little bit different. My specialty is conceptual design, so pre-visualization is kind of an offshoot. It's kind of a natural evolution for a designer like myself. Again, essentially what I'm doing is illustrations, paintings, whatever, basically to help them understand what they're going to make. In the video games, it has to be a little bit more literal and concrete because they're actually going to create this in 3D space. And so what I create, they actually have to build. So it has there's more of a practicality there. Whereas in films, it's a little bit more blue sky. You can pretty much just come up with anything. Because basically what you're trying to do is woo the movie studio into giving you millions of dollars, so the filmmaker can actually make the movie. So in that regard, it's a little bit more free. So anyway, let me jump into this. Let me just start off with a backstory here. This guy right there, his name is David Dozeretz. He's my mentor of sorts. Back in 2002, just a real quick. Get this in. Okay, forget it. Anyway, that is George Lucas, David, Rick McCallum, the producer of the Star Wars prequels, and Doug Chiang, who's the design director. So basically, back in 2002, I contacted David because I noticed that he, well, slight backstory on David. What David did was he was working at Industrial Light and Magic in the art department, and they're working on, what was that movie called? Mission Impossible, the first one. So they had to figure out some method of creating the whole sequence where the bullet train is being chased by the helicopter underneath the English Channel. So David, what the director needed was he needed actually to see the scene to sell this visual effects shot so they can get enough money to actually produce the visual effects shot. And back at that point, computer graphics were still very pretty new, and so it was a very expensive process to go through. So David, he was probably about 23 in that photo. He was like a little wonderkind. He came in and took some basic 3D animation programs and created moving storyboards. And what that does is it essentially allows the filmmaker to actually see the pacing and the action, the camera movement, the composition, any visual effects that would be in the shot. In traditional methods in filmmaking, they just do storyboards. And they still do that, but they usually work hand in hand with a pre-visualization artist. So they draw the illustration in a little board representing the film frame, but you just can't get a sense of the movement, basically, and that's what sells the shot. So David created the sequence for Mission Impossible, and then from that, Rick McCallum, the guy in the blue shirt, who's a total jerk, but I know that's a whole other side story. He saw David's stuff and said, okay, that's fantastic. Let's set up a department. So David was invited up to Skywalker Ranch, and he worked with Doug Chang, who actually did the conceptual design, and basically set up a department specifically for pre-visualization. So if you go watch the Star Wars movies behind the scenes DVDs, usually they have a little section specifically about pre-visualization. And David created the pod race sequence, and so they created that, and that really sold George. And the other asset to pre-visualization of that sort is when Lucas, who's a renowned editor, he loves doing his movies in the editing room. He has live action films that is shot and edited together, but usually when there's a sequence that requires some sort of computer graphics, they kind of leave that open, to either just hand-drawn pictures or he'll just say visual effects shot, insert. What David does is he takes that information, takes those mini movies, and they're able to cut that in, so you get more or less a complete film to actually visualize. And usually that helps the sound designers who can actually create the score and then create the sound effects to go on top of that. So it's a very organic process. So what I'm going to do now is show you some stuff that may or may not be allowed.
Is this the Disney? Okay.
Well, no, this one's all right.
Okay.
I recently worked on The Day the Earth Stood Still. David pulled me out after about 7 years. He's been trying to get me to jump into pre-visualization. So basically what happened is I went out to LA. We worked on the Universal backlot, confined in a windowless, dark, drab office space. Fortunately, it was only for 2 weeks.
Which you probably loved, right?
Which we love. Yeah, well,
Yeah, don't.
it's basically everything you read about the filmmaker Keanu Reeves or anybody else saying this was a wonderful dreamlike experience. That's a bunch of crap. Basically what happened, I was only there for 2 weeks because the movie was on the fritz of being shut down. And so what happened is the filmmaker was throwing a temper tantrum because he's a young kid. He went to USC, and so he figured just based on that, he deserves $200 million that he asked the studios that. They laughed at him and basically started cutting the budget down. So we never saw the director until the last day. But we had a blast because we got to drive all around the back lot to go to lunch and take pictures of the tourists, taking pictures of us. And so, I mean, that part was fun. So basically what I'm going to show you was my 2 weeks on The Day the Earth Stood Still. You can go ahead and film this.
Okay.
So the original opening to this I don't know if anybody's seen the movie, the remake. Okay, the original's better. that was the consensus among everybody, including the visual effects supervisor, who actually worked on the last Starfighter, so he went all the way back to the very beginning. So basically, the initial sequence was going to have this giant orb sphere thing starting really close to the camera and slowly rotating and moving away from the camera. And it's supposed to be a visual trick. You're supposed to think, okay, is this a planet, whatever, until basically it starts veering off towards the Earth, and you see small meteorites zipping past it. And so it's basically a forced perspective, trick with scale. So you basically follow the orb as it flies through the Earth's atmosphere, through thunderheads, past flocks of geese, and everything crashes in the Earth. And a little farmer comes driving by like Superman in a little truck, and it zaps him and basically it's like the size of a dime, as it turns out, and it takes a little zap of his finger. And they actually kept part of that in the movie.